Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about the data analytics market, key trends, what companies are liking, what companies are not liking so much. We're talking about common best practices, among other things. To discuss that, I'm joined by Brian Wood, Research Director at Dresner Advisory Services. Brian, good to have you with us today.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely, and I think about the data analytics market is I think of it as a pretty chaotic place. I mean, many of the emerging IT markets move really fast. Cloud market moves really fast. Artificial intelligence market moves pretty much at the speed of light. But data analytics, it seems to be as chaotic as any of the markets out there. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, I think, and we found, we just published another study on analytic data infrastructure. And
Right.
one of the things that we find is that there's a great deal of diversity among the different functions within organizations as to
Hmm.
what their priorities are for their
Hmm.
analytic data infrastructure. There also tends to be very little concern about corporate standards, which
Right.
means that if you want it, you go ahead and buy it. And it tends to basically it causes somewhat of an organically grown rather than a strategically planned analytic data infrastructure. And of course, there's complexity that goes with that.
Well, let's talk about the report a little bit. It was, how many people responded and what was the overall scope of the report?
I don't have the exact numbers with me here. I think it was
Right.
something like 370 or
Hmm.
close to 400 respondents and
Yep.
across different geographies and industries. So
Sure.
the report slices these respondents by industry, by size of company, by geography,
Hmm.
and then by function as well, which was what we were talking about before. So one of
Right.
the things that I found interesting was that the IT function places a low priority on corporate standards.
Huh.
Typically, those have been the people who have enforced those standards.
Right,
So
right.
if you want to
I'm
install
surprised to
some,
hear that.
eh, yeah, I
Of
was as
all the
well. But
divisions that would have loose standards, sure. Go ahead.
this is the first year that I've been involved with this market study. But Bill Hostman, who is my co-author on this, has
Hmm.
done it for several years, and he said that he has seen this year over year since he's been doing
Mm.
it. That
Okay.
basically there's been a low focus on the corporate standards. In the past, there's also been a pretty low focus on cost as well.
Hmm.
Although with things changing the way they have during the pandemic, there's been a little more focus back on cost, but still very little
Hmm.
priority put on corporate standards there.
Hmm.
So
So if you're looking at
one of the
the end,
things that we've found,
go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
please.
I was going to say, I mentioned before too that one of the things that tends to help to limit this kind of spread across the organization of different components is having a chief data officer, a CDO,
Right.
or a
Yep.
chief analytics officer,
Yep.
because that becomes a focus for them to make sure they have a cohesive and efficient analytic data infrastructure, as opposed to a
Hmm.
little of this here and a little of that there that may or may not talk to each other
Right.
very well.
So you need a chief officer to run herd over the madness. In other words. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to set direction at least. In most cases, they don't really play the role of the cop trying to enforce it.
Hmm.
Although, if you have the C in front of your title, you tend to get
Right.
attention when you when
Right.
you when you when you. And I mean, there's good reasons for it. It's efficiency, it's cost, and it's really the effectiveness of your analytic data infrastructure.
Hmm.
You are going to have a lot of different use cases, and it's interesting. One of the things that you had asked about and that I found interesting is the highest priority use case. I
Hmm.
will say I consider to be table stakes. Now, what that is it's basically reporting capabilities. So,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know,
Without that,
I
you don't
think
even
that
really have data analytics software. I mean, without reporting
exactly.
capabilities, it's like a car without tires.
Yeah, I mean, you start, it's kind of like the statistical world. You start with descriptive statistics, right?
Hmm.
This is what we have. Then you start to look at predictive and prescriptive types of statistics, and that's where you start to get into the the analytic exploration use cases, the data science use cases, and that kind of
Hmm.
thing. But those have been a lower priority for a while. They have been increasing, and we have In the study, of course, there's numbers in terms of which use cases are higher priorities for which industries, as well
Mhm.
as, like I said, we
Mhm.
slice it by size of company and geography. Um, Go
So
ahead,
if you
please.
look at at the overall report, obviously you were a co-author, so you know the report inside out, and you know the market. I mean, what is a single finding from the report that you found particularly revealing and particularly meaningful for companies?
So for me, I think that there's a lot that needs to be done to put governance over this process. And governance
Mm,
is a widely used term, which I'll be in the next month. I'll be publishing a note on governance for governance, risk, and compliance professionals.
okay.
Last month, we myself and three co-authors published a general note on data governance in
Mm,
organizations, and
hmm.
then we're doing point of view type one. So I'm doing the one from a GRC professional's perspective. Another one of the analysts is doing one from a BI professionals. Another one is doing from a sales and marketing perspective,
Mm,
and the final one is a data scientist's perspective. And I think if you're in marketing, your goals for data governance are going to be very different than if you're in finance.
right.
And
Yes.
if you're a GRC professional, which a lot of people don't really know, in some organizations, depending on what industry you're in, if it's a tightly regulated industry, the the governance part tends to take a back seat to the compliance part. So
Uh-huh.
you're
Okay.
and to me
Right.
the only difference between governance and compliance is where the requirements come from.
Hmm.
Governance is placing requirements on yourself for their internally.
Right.
Compliance is from external. So, in the
Yes.
financial services industry, you've got, we don't need to go into all the
Yeah.
details there, but
Right.
um,
And the
so,
R of the
for
GRC, the risk is really comes from both internal and external, but that may be a whole another question. Uh,
well, and
yeah, go ahead.
it's not the paper we're here to talk about, but one of the things that I found is that the approach, the risk tolerance, which
Hmm.
drives a lot of how you do governance, is really a cultural thing.
Hmm.
And the culture of the company is so much harder and so much slower to change than the technology. So,
Right.
if you're in an organization that has had a command and control type structure, and you have a new chief data officer and he says you will only touch the following data in the following ways, that's fine because they're used to
Right.
that. But
Sure.
if so you get the idea.
So if you look
One of the
at the
things
total,
that I found
oh,
interesting.
go ahead. Yeah,
No,
please.
go ahead, but
I was,
for me, and it's still kind of a low priority to most of the respondents on here,
mhm.
but the concept of, and people will refer to it as unstructured data.
Right.
I don't believe there is such a thing. There
Oh.
is more explicitly structured and less explicitly structured. So
So all that
a
stuff on
video
social media,
is not on is not
like comments and photos and posts, you don't think of that as unstructured data?
no, because language has a structure. It has syntax. It has all kinds of components to it. If you
Hmm.
look at a video, it has a
Right.
codex. The codex tells you how to interpret that stream of bits, right? So that's the first level of structure. Now that I have it showing an image and giving audio, output from it,
Right.
there's structure around that. What is the language? What is it, eh, I mean, you can even do with various models, you can do things like sentiment analysis on it. So you can say, was this person being sarcastic? Were they angry? Were they happy? Were they, you know, and so there's a rich amount of information in this. And again, I don't like to use the word unstructured, but I'll
Right.
say, binary data, blobs they used to call it, binary
Right. Okay.
large objects, right?
All right. Yeah.
And and while they're still not doing a whole lot with it, what we're seeing is that more organizations are starting to look at that.
Hmm.
Uh,
Oh
it's
yeah,
going to
definitely.
it's it's going to be interesting because, and again, go back to my governance, risk, and compliance side of things. There's a thing called PII, which is personally identifiable information,
Right.
and it is tightly regulated, not just in specific industries, but like, you have the California Consumer Protection Act, you have the European general, I forget it, but
Right.
GDPR is,
Yep.
so you
Yep.
have all these things that are telling you what you can and can't do with PII type data.
Mhm.
Well, when you start to use videos, and those videos, for example, may show you pull in your car, so there's a license plate number. That's
Mhm.
personally identifiable. It
Right.
may show your house number as you walk into your house, and it may show your face and facial recognition. So there's a whole lot of challenges that will come out as people start to really use the information that we find in video and in image and in audio that hasn't been addressed yet.
Mhm.
But it is a rich source of information, and
Oh, well,
it's
sure.
only
I
a
mean,
matter of
it's
time.
probably the richest source. But if you think about use cases for ADI platforms, the analytic data infrastructure platforms, what did most of the respondents in the report list as their top priority, and what does that suggest for the ADI market in terms of where it's going in the
Sure,
future?
sure. And I think we spoke about this a little earlier, and
Right.
it's really surprising to me because I consider the top ranked use case to be table stakes, and that is business
Aha.
reporting.
Gotcha.
It's
Okay.
just, so it's the as is. It's like, can I look around my organization and report on everything? And it doesn't start to look at so that would be the equivalent of the descriptive statistics.
Mhm.
Then the next thing is the predictive ones, and that
Right.
we start to move into data science type of use
Right.
cases with that. And then there's the proscript or prescriptive, where we're actually going to make recommendations based on those models and those statistics. So
Mhm.
at this point, the table stakes are still the most important thing. They want to be able to do reporting based on their analytic data infrastructure. I'm seeing, because I work with a number of different organizations, and some of them are fairly mature in their approach, and are starting to try to do essentially machine learning and artificial intelligence at scale.
Oh,
So
okay.
rolling out multiple models in multiple channels in multiple ways, and as
Right.
they start to do that, and again, one of the things that I've seen, we already talked about, which is that it's not tightly governed. Corporate
Right.
standards aren't important. So if one person
Yep.
finds a tool that is purely cloud based and web based and it works well for them, they will go ahead and buy it. And again, a lot of these tools and products have freemium models where someone can put their personal credit card in and use it for a month, and
Right.
then of course once they get used to the tool, they're not going to let it go, and it
Sure.
becomes part of your analytic data
It's it's
infrastructure.
it's it's like
uh,
shadow IT, but for data analytics.
yeah, it's the way houses in New England were built. Started as a square, and then you had a kid, so you put a little salt box on that, and then another one here.
Okay.
So it's rather by evolution than by planning.
What about the difference between cloud and on-premise, software? Which is more popular for the ADI platforms? Or what about the hybrid idea there?
Yeah, that's another one that I find very interesting. And Bill and I kind of agreed on some of what we learned from the data, which is,
Hmm.
first of all, cloud is, and we've got I think it's, yeah, on page 20 shows basically the chart of the different deployment models, and cloud as a service is number one.
Mm,
Um,
okay. Yeah.
there's on the chart after that shows the year over year, so you can see how it's changed. But
It's
one of the
increased, I'm
things that
sure.
I find interesting is, so even in the large organizations, like there's one large financial institution that I've worked with that has a cloud first strategy. They want everything in the cloud, but they're not starting from a greenfield situation. They have lots of on-premise type of
Right.
systems already.
Of
So
course.
in
Right.
order to get to that cloud vision, which I think most organizations want to get to, at least partial cloud, if not cloud first type of strategy. But
Right.
in order to get there from where you are today, you need a hybrid analytic infrastructure. It has
Of
to report
course.
on the on premise and the cloud. And of
Right.
course, then you have multi cloud as well. So you have multiple public clouds, you have virtual private clouds. So having an infrastructure that will work with all of those, and I think particularly for the larger organizations that have been around for longer, it's a stepping stone on the path. If they want to get to cloud, and most of them do. The survey
Right.
says, that is a preferred deployment approach for most industries and most functions. But in order to get there, you have to go through the hybrid to get to a cloud infrastructure.
Well, how far away is
Again,
that
if you have a
first
chief data,
vision? Oh, is it
I mean,
almost here, or is it
it
far
really
away?
depends.
Okay.
If you're, I mean, it's, and I spent 25 years in the consulting business before this, so forgive me if I give a consulting answer, which is it depends, and it really does depend.
Right.
It largely depends on the existing infrastructure that you have in place.
Hmm.
If especially organizations that went with a I tend to use the colloquial term, the roll your own approach, right? So
Right.
they
Yep.
looked at packages, but decided they could build something that did exactly what they wanted, which they did. Tends to be
Hmm.
not your core competency. If you're a bank, you shouldn't be doing software. If you're a
Right. Right.
healthcare agency, you shouldn't be doing software. Right?
Right.
But the ones that did that and built things themselves sort of built themselves an anchor in the
Hmm.
on-premise world.
Interesting. So it actually worked for him. I'm
It's not
surprised.
now. Well, works for them is one way to look at it. It makes them less agile. So,
Yeah. Okay.
if you can't, if you can't turn it off and turn something in the cloud on relatively easily, that's it. The way I look at it in terms of basically economic friction. you
Hmm.
know,
Right.
you can't move quickly because of there's inertia.
Right. What
So
about
I think
the
there, you get organizations like a lot of the ones in the Bay Area that are startups that are a few years old that
right cloud
really
native?
started with at
Yeah.
least, yeah, maybe not current generation of technology, but pretty close,
Hmm.
right? So if they didn't start with a mainframe background, they started, backbone, I should have said. If they start with, a more modern approach to it, it makes it easier to move things that way.
Right.
And especially those that kind of took an open source approach too, since
Hmm.
largely that can be moved around fairly
Hmm.
easily.
But what about the factors that make creating a coherent strategy for analytics projects difficult? For example, the range of innovation and the variety of ADI platforms. How can executives and business leaders deal with this one? It seems like a really thorny challenge.
Well, and I think we talked a little bit about this before, and it's kind of a
Yep.
theme throughout my career is technology is easy to change. People are not,
Right.
and so
Very
it's a
true.
cultural thing. When I was doing consulting jobs, I would actually turn down large contracts if they wouldn't include money for change management,
Oh wow. Okay.
communications plans, ways,
Yeah.
basically you need to learn who are going to be the champions and who are going to be the obstacles,
Mhm.
and not just who they are, but why. Because you have to motivate people to want to change.
Mhm.
And that's not easy in any industry, and in our industry, in the IT industry, it's particularly hard because people tend to associate their value with their current skill set in many cases,
Yes. Right.
and that kind of is an obstacle to change.
Mhm. Yeah, let's look to the future for a moment. If you look to the future of data analytics, say 3 to 5 years from now, I think certain things are probably fairly predictable. One is the role of automation is going to be bigger. The role of
Mhm.
AI is going to be bigger. Perhaps the citizen data scientist might emerge, but may or may not emerge. I mean, what is your sense of the future of the analytics data infrastructure market a few years out?
Well, I'll comment on the data scientist one first because I enjoy that one.
Yeah, that's a cool one.
The citizen data scientist is how data science got started.
Really? Okay.
I remember when I was at another analyst firm years ago, a big analyst firm, talking to a CTO of an organization
Hmm.
who had installed, I won't name the vendor, but a statistical package on a server underneath of his desk. And he built, and he literally he built some AI models and then called down to his IT department and said, I need you to roll these out to production. And it's like,
Okay.
no, wait a minute. So again, I mean, my governance side, just
Freaked
it,
out.
it yeah. And so the citizen data scientist is an interesting concept, and if you look at sort of um, I think they refer to it often as the data grid approach, where
Hmm.
you have governance that is decentralized.
Hmm.
Right? So if you have decentralized data governance, which essentially means that people know their domain, they know everything they need to know about their domain, and they maintain the artifacts to make that available to everyone else in the organization. And if you do that, then that same kind of decentralized approach to data science can also be useful. You need a strong leader who understands how you can put standards in place that don't stifle creativity.
Hmm.
You know, that
Mhm.
it was the marketing guys, the creative guys when I started in this business. Now it's the data scientists to a large
Right.
extent,
Oh, they
and so
rule
you have
everything at
you
this
have to
point.
and you need to put, I'll say, frictionless governance in place so they can
Hmm.
get to what they need, they can do what they need, but
Mhm.
there is an audit trail to it. And that's, I use that term
Mhm.
generically, I don't mean literally, although in some industries you absolutely need that.
Mhm.
I know, I mentioned GDPR, which is a privacy regulation in the EU. They also have regulations about, just like you have the right to be forgotten, so that you have
Mhm.
to delete the information within
Right.
a short period of time.
Sure.
They also have the right to have a model explained to you. So your
Hmm.
loan was turned down by this bank. I want to know why.
Right.
Well, our
Explainability.
model
Yeah.
said yeah, our model said you're a bad risk. Well, what were the inputs to your model, and what was the algorithm of your model?
Right.
Most organizations, unless they're very mature in their data science, can't answer those questions. He said they have
Right.
to go find the person who did that model and get him on the phone or her on the phone and have him, and it needs to be a repeatable process that takes as little time away from their productivity as possible. So
Right.
if you have artifacts, and I won't name the different tools, but
Mhm.
there are model governance tools that keep track of things like, you can set parameters about what degree of accuracy and how we measure it, what degree of robustness and how do we measure it, how
Mhm.
often do we retrain the model, how often do we remodel this. Those are the kind of things that can be automated, and you don't have to call somebody up who is trying to do analysis on a new model and ask them to dig through their notes and tell you how they did this and why.
Mhm.
So
I don't want to get us too derailed
for
off the
me, for
future.
me,
If
this
you look a few
yeah.
years out to the future in terms of the data analytics market, what do you see in terms of either AI or ML or not? Or what do you say in the year 2025? What will data analytics look like?
So I'm often called an idealist because I tend to look at the way things should be instead of the way they are.
Ah, okay. Yeah, good. I
so
like that.
so
Yeah.
I'll say, with a grain of salt, I will say that we will have AI capabilities that will enhance the way we do our jobs,
Hmm. Right.
and not replace them. And I mean, because and it's not a I mean, there's a work, the future of work part aspect of it is one part of it, but realistically, we have models that do a lot of pieces of what a human brain does well, but
Hmm.
there isn't the master algorithm. And not
Right.
quoting, but there is a book by that name, and it actually does a good job of surveying the different types of models. And so what you'll have the ability for an AI system to look at the different analytics in your organization and
Hmm.
make recommendations. You
Right.
know, like this is good, but really you're only using the trending. You're not using the actual data. So, or
Mhm.
I mean, I'm making up cases, but
Sure.
sort of the supervisor model that will then keep track of and manage the different models that you deploy across your organization.
Hmm.
And it's, again, the roadblock is people. People are going to
Right.
say I remember
Right.
when I was in college and I was doing forecasting, and there was a contest between the computers and the old the old hats, the guys who did it basically pulled the number out of a hat. And back then, I mean, that wasn't that long ago, but it was in the late 70s and early 80s, and the
Right.
machine learning models, the AI models couldn't keep up at all.
Yeah, I bet
It
back
was
then.
just
Sure.
it-
Right.
yeah. Now, obviously, now we've got models that beat the best chess players
Right.
and all that. So, but
Sure.
it's you have to have something to model, right?
Hmm.
So the way humans process information may or may not be the most efficient, but
Right.
just taking that and putting it on a silicon substrate instead of soft wetware, so to speak, that helps a
Right.
lot. But you
Yes.
still need the people to say, this is
Yep.
how I think. These are the connections that I make that led me to this conclusion. So
Yes.
I
But
think
yeah.
going back to the analytic data infrastructure market, though, I do think, and I've mentioned the chief data officer and the chief analytics officer a few times. I
Hmm.
think that is going to drive success within this. So having a
Mm,
strategy
okay.
where,
Hmm.
because again, creative people are great, but we don't want creativity for creativity's sake.
Right.
We want
Right.
it to move closer to, and I won't go into all the details, but basically, what you're doing is optimizing a multi-dimensional function because
Hmm.
we want to increase profitability. We want to increase customer satisfaction. When I
Hmm.
was a CRM analyst, people would call me up and say, I need to increase my customer satisfaction and customer retention. And I said,
Right.
oh, that's easy. So you give your product away and you fix it for free, and
Yeah. That
you'll
that
never
that
lose
would
a customer. I
increase
said,
satisfaction levels.
so then they said, well, but what about then we won't make any money? Oh, I said, so then maybe there are a few other dimensions to this too. Let's talk
Mhm.
about and I'm a big balanced scorecard guy. So we'll talk about
Mhm.
the customer dimension. We'll talk about the process and innovation dimension. We'll talk about the product dimension and the
Mhm.
financial dimension.
Mhm.
And so I think it's going to be a long time before we can automate that that process, basically.
Mhm.
Um, the
Yeah.
interesting thing is it's not a static function either. So this is a dynamic multi-dimensional utility function, to
Right.
use the economic terms for it.
Yep.
So and optimizing even something that is a static function is not always easy. We have statistical methods for that. What I'm exploring myself is something that I call Bayesian priorities.
Mhm.
And if you know how Bayesian forecasts work, they take prior probabilities and adjust them based on current experience, right?
Hmm.
So if we have, say as an organization, we have a goal of €1 million of revenue for the year and 33% gross margin.
Okay.
And 3 months into the year, we're at 900,000 of sales and our gross margin is 3%.
Aha.
Guess
Okay.
what?
That's a
Those
problem.
two they don't have the same priority anymore. It
Right.
used to be that profitability and top line revenue had the same priority when we started, or maybe you can seed those, just like with a Bayesian algorithm. You can seed those priorities however you want,
Mhm.
but your current attainment and experience changes those priorities. So it's you're chasing a moving function, basically.
Brian, I think you've said it. I think this could be a very long conversation because the analytics market is a big topic. But I appreciate you sharing your expertise. It was super interesting. I'll send you a link to the podcast when it's done. Thank you very much.
The only way I'll wrap that up, since I did kind of diverge into my performance management aspect of it. So
Okay.
the way it ties back to what we've been talking about is that you have typically those different dimensions of performance in different functions of the organization. So
Hmm.
that's what's driving this kind of the diversity in terms of what they have in priorities and what they use and what use cases are important to them too.
Hmm.
So I think as organizations start to try to get their arms around what they're optimizing, they will see that they then need to come up with a more unified analytics infrastructure for that.
Gotcha. I think that's key, definitely. Well, Brian, you said it. Thank you very much. It was super interesting. I'm sure I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.